that any rights that or authority, any obligations, authorities that were not specifically given to the federal government remained with the states. And as you've been studying the Constitution, it really is a remarkable concept, the way it works, and the genius of people like James Madison to put something together like this, which has stood the time for 230 years or whatever it would be. That it's just remarkable. And what it is, it's this dynamic tension between the federal government and the state governments, and this concept of federalism. The Articles of Confederation, as you might remember, did not work because the federal government had absolutely no authority and the states did whatever they want. So when they did the Constitution, they vested the federal government with certain responsibilities and authorities, the ability to make war, to levy taxes, to do things like that. But they left most of the power to the states. And the 10th Amendment was sort of an insurance policy. It really wasn't necessary, a lot of the Federalists thought, because the Constitution itself was pretty strict, and here are the rights that the federal government has, and if they didn't give any others, then they belong to the states. And in fact, some of them were concerned that if you put a 10th Amendment like this into the Bill of Rights, it would imply that the federal government had a lot more responsibility than they had meant to give it. So they put in the 10th Amendment, and although some of the Federalists grumbled about it, it was part of the Bill of Rights that passed in, I guess, the first session of Congress. And for about the first 50 years, the 10th Amendment was really not mentioned much in any Supreme Court cases. They would decide federal authority based on the necessary and proper clause or the commerce clause, things like that. During the New Deal in the 30s, the expansion of federal authority exploded. It really did grow, and to some people's, for example, my point of view, they kind of overreached. The Supreme Court perhaps made some things up that weren't in the. I'm more of a literalist, and if it weren't in the original Constitution, it shouldn't be. The famous case was dealing with growing of grain crops, and the federal government was trying to limit the amount of grain that you could grow to raise the price during the Depression for the farmers. And they went after this one guy who was growing grain for his own consumption. They said that doesn't matter that you're not selling it in another state. By growing it for your own consumption, you're affecting the amount of grain that's grown in other states, and therefore over the Commerce Clause, we have the authority to regulate it. And the Supreme Court said, yes, you do. And so many of us kind of look back at that and say, my goodness, what powers doesn't the federal government have? Recently, within the last probably 10 or 15 years, there's been some slight movement against limiting some of the powers of the federal government through the 10th Amendment clause. But it's still, to many people, as a state legislator, I look at things like the federal government telling us what the speed limit should be, the federal government telling us what you have to do with impaired drivers, a lot of things like that, dealing with drivers and driver safety. I'm really not sure where you find that in the federal Constitution. They think that because they're giving us federal money, that gives them the authority to come in and tell us what to do. Nevertheless, I think on balance, things have worked out pretty well over the last couple hundred years, and it's just sort of the give and take between the states and the federal government that's going to continue. Perhaps I'd be more comfortable, though, rather than trying to talk to you and lecture you, if you will, about the U.S. Constitution, to talk a little bit about the Virginia Constitution and the legislative reaction to give and take with that. Let me give you just a little bit of background about my experiences, and that might kind of put things in perspective. As Dr. Cooperman said, I was first elected in 1987, and during my first 15 years, I enjoyed, I'd gotten to the point where I could sit on the back row and didn't really have to pay as much attention. I gotten to the point where I was chairman of a pretty significant committee, what we call the Courts of Justice, which is like our Judiciary Committee, and it really was. I was enjoying life, and my party, the Republican Party, had been in the minority literally since the Civil War, and except for a brief period after the war where there were some, they call them Republican adjusters, which is sort of a unusual group of people. The Republican Party gradually got control of the House, and so we were able to elect a speaker. It takes a majority vote to do that, and we had the majority vote. And we elected this guy who everybody assumed would be the next speaker. He'd worked his heart out trying to get us to the majority, and everything was fine. He got into a little bit of problem back home with a lawsuit kind of situation, and he had to resign abruptly. And he only been speaker for about a year. So everybody's saying, golly day, who are we going to put in as speaker? And I was thinking, and I got a couple of phone calls from people saying, hey, you ought to throw your hat in the ring. I don't think you got any skeletons in your closet or something like that. My wife and I talked a lot about it, and prayed about it and decided, well, I think this is what we want to do. And initially, when I decided to run for speaker back in 2002, I guess, there were about 4 or 5 other members that had indicated they were running too. And one by one, they dropped out for various reasons. And I remember my brother called me one day. He lives up in Sterling, and he said, hey, Bill, I see in the Washington Post that you're the only one left running for speaker. He said, if you don't win, it's not going to look good. And but I was able to eke it out. And when I first became speaker, I really had no idea what to do. It was kind of like the dog that caught the fire truck. What do you do now? I did know that I kind of presumed that part of my job as speaker would be to make sure that the trains run on time, that everybody gets a chance to be heard, that there's civility in the body and that sort of thing. And it kind of dawned on me over the next couple of months that governors are here for a 4-year term in Virginia. They're term limited after their first term. They can sit out 4 years and come back and run, and that's happened once or twice. But normally they're just here for 4 years. Speakers can stay for a while. I thought at first, well, maybe I'll stay here for 4 or 6 years. Who knows? This is an opportunity for me, I decided, to try and put into place some of my ideas about what would make Virginia a better state, what would be a better government situation. And we've been able over the years to put in some policies and some ideas that I think have been very successful. Not my ideas. I like to tell people I haven't had an original idea probably in 70 years. That's given me credit for a couple of years on top of that. But I get great ideas from constituents. People will come and they'll say, Bill, you ought to think about doing this, or how about doing that? And we really have done some stuff over the years that I can't take credit for, but they've been, I think, pretty impactful. So I became speaker, and it's gone on longer than I would have imagined. I've enjoyed it very much. It's time to look at the next chapter in my life and see what I want to do in the next 30 years. But and I'm still groping around. Dr. Kubenman was right. She was relating a little conversation we had before. I don't have any hobbies. I've never played golf. I don't play tennis. I don't do woodworking or whatever. My hobbies have always been, before I was elected, just working for not-for-profits in the area, as she said, the Chamber of Commerce and the hospital and things like that. And then my hobby, if you will, for the last 30 years has been legislative stuff. And so I'm really a little bit concerned about what I'm going to do when all that's gone. But something will happen. Something will come along. But one of the things that I've discovered, particularly in the last couple of years, about the Virginia Constitution. First of all, the Virginia Constitution is unlike the federal Constitution in the sense that it's a lot longer. We're on about our 4th Constitution since 1776, and it's easier to amend than the federal Constitution. The federal Constitution, as you know, is pretty difficult to amend. The Virginia Constitution requires a resolution to be passed by a legislative body, and then there has to be an intervening election. Like this year we have an election. And then the new legislature, which comes back the next January, would have to pass that exact same resolution again. And then if that happens, if it passes two legislative bodies, two legislative cycles, then in that fall it goes to the people for ratification. And it's not unusual to see on the ballot a constitutional proposal from time to time, and I guess that's good. It does kind of clutter up the Constitution, and you kind of wonder why didn't we think about that when we wrote the Constitution. But people always have brilliant ideas, and they come along. One of the things that I got involved with this year was an interpretation of the Virginia Constitution as it deals with the governor's authority to restore civil rights to convicted felons. And some of you may remember earlier this year, there was a lot in the paper about the fact that Governor McAuliffe, there's a process in the Constitution where if someone's been convicted of a felony, they lose all their civil rights, and they never get them back unless the governor restores them. That's a pretty strict standard. Some states never take your civil rights away. You can vote from jail in Vermont. In areas, I would say the most common thing is after you've been out for been released from prison for a couple of years, a certain number of years, they'll be automatically restored. In Virginia, we don't do that. Now, we do have a process where the governor can restore them on an individual basis, and some governors, Governor Wilder, Governor McDonald, both parties, have been pretty generous in a lot of the restoration that they've done. But Governor McAuliffe took it on himself just to restore everybody's rights, and we felt that clearly was not within the Virginia Constitution that set out the specific way and talked about how he individually would look at each case rather than just do them all in blank. So we sued him, Howell versus McAuliffe. It was my brief moment of fame. It was in the state court, so it went to the Virginia Supreme Court, and the Virginia Supreme Court agreed with us that the governor did not have that blanket authority. Unfortunately, he kept doing it and just kind of flaunting what the Supreme Court had told him. So we sued him again, and we probably went a little too far with this. We asked that he be held in contempt of court, and although the governor doesn't ordinarily appoint Supreme Court justices, I guess they all felt a little awkward about seeing the governor trundle off to jail, and so they didn't agree with us on that case, and it's been a problem, but the court's the final say so, and there's not a whole lot that we can do about it. But that was sort of my brief encounter with the Constitution as it relates to the state, or the state Constitution. I've also had a lot of involvement this year in the federal Constitution through the issues of redistricting, and I'm sure some of you all are familiar with the issues that come up with redistricting in Virginia. Every 10 years, the U.S. Constitution says you have to redraw the federal maps for population shifts and population changes for the congressional lines for the members of Congress, or the House of Representatives. And we also, at that time, with the new census, redraw the state House and the state Senate lines. In Virginia, the legislature does it. It has to be approved by the governor. And for years, under the 1965, I guess, Civil Rights Act, we had to have approval of the Justice Department on any map that we drew to make sure that they weren't being racially unfair. And several suits were brought against the plans that we drew back. This was, to me, kind of ironic. We drew these plans back in 2011, and in 2016 they sued us over those plans. We're going to draw new lines again in 2021, but and it's costing an enormous amount of money to defend these plans. And they're in the federal court system. Well, actually, there's two suits going on right now. One of them's in the federal court system, and that case has gone up to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's really kind of interesting. I had not been to a United States Supreme Court oral argument before, and went up for that. And it was interesting watching the give and take between the justices and the attorneys. We didn't necessarily prevail on that. They sent it back to the three-judge panel that originally had heard it and said, we want you to hear it again, given these new standards. And they kind of made up some new standards about redistricting, which we thought was a little unfair. But again, what can you do about it? So that right now, that case is at a three-judge panel, and it'll be heard. These are one member of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals and two federal district court judges make up the three-judge panel. And that will be heard. They're doing depositions and interrogatories and things right now, and that'll be heard probably in the next couple of weeks. And undoubtedly, whoever loses that case will appeal it to the U.S. Supreme Court, so it'll go back up again. And I'm really not sure how that's going to turn out. At the same time, there's another lawsuit that's been brought. I call this the do-gooders lawsuit. There's a group of people in Richmond who just like to complain, and they brought a lawsuit that is, we think, totally meritless, has no merit. And there are several Virginia Supreme Court cases right on the point that have ruled against what their position is. But nevertheless, we have to spend the money, and you have to spend the money. It's coming from the state to go through the state courts with that. That case will be heard by a circuit court judge, and then I'm sure it will be appealed to the Virginia Supreme Court, no matter who wins that. And that's probably another 6 months off before we find out where that's going. So there's been a flurry of activity over the last couple of years with the legislature and the different court systems, the federal and the Virginia court system, which is kind of interesting, and it again speaks to what you all are studying in this case. In this course, where you're learning about the Constitution and how it impacts your life and how it impacts our government. Again, the federal Constitution is a marvelous document. I don't think there's anything like it in the world, and I think that it has guided us and held us together as a country for over 2 centuries, and I think that it will continue to do so. It's a great system of checks and balances and sharing authority between the states and the federal government. Like anything else, it's not perfect, but we're not perfect, and so we're going to have a lot of imperfection with us. I'm really good at rambling on, but I don't think you all want me to ramble on. Do you have any questions or any thoughts that might have come up?
I've got one here, and then I've got a few that were brought up in my freshman seminar. So I guess I'll start with those.
Okay.
So in my freshman seminar, which is a campaigns and elections seminar, they wanted to hear about the process of deciding to run not just for office, like in essence what was on your mind, and moving from somebody who was interested in politics to running for elected office. Okay. And then that decision to run for re-election, that you liked what you were doing and wanted to hold the seat. Sure. If you could talk about that. Yeah,
that's a great question. And one thing whenever I talk with classes at universities, I like to encourage them to get involved in politics, and usually I don't need to encourage a whole lot because an awful lot of you are involved one way or the other, but it's really important that you get involved, and I can't think of a better way of getting involved than being in an elected office. I grew up in Alexandria before there was a beltway, but if there had been one, it was inside the beltway, and then we moved later on to Fairfax, out to the country. But I can remember growing up, and my dad worked for the World Bank, and people, and we would talk about politics and public policy and things like that at the dinner table. And so I kind of grew up being interested in this stuff. Also grew up being a New Deal Democrat. Both my mom and dad were pretty strong Democrats. And I got into college, and I thought, I really, I want to find out what all this stuff's about. And one summer I read a bunch of books, and I tried to be balanced on conservative and versus liberal ideas, and that combined with getting a job ultimately kind of convinced me more to be a Republican. But whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent or a Green person, it's good to get involved, and it's good to let people know how you think. When I first started working in North Carolina, we got involved in a couple of congressional races, trying to help people down there. You know, just knocking on doors and helping pass out literature. And then we moved back to Virginia, and I continued to keep involved. I'll tell you something that, two things that really impressed me as far as running for office. When I was a senior in college, I ran for president of the senior class. I'm not sure why, and didn't do anything. Didn't try and solicit fraternity brothers' help or things like that. And I lost by 3 votes. And I'm thinking, daggone it, if I bet you I had 5 fraternity brothers that didn't vote, or maybe they voted against me. But the point that was drawn home to me then is elections can be close, and you got to go out and get every person. And then I worked on a supervisor's race up in Fairfax County when we lived up there, and the guy we were supporting won by 6 votes or 7 votes. And then I thought, boy, I bet I helped him. I bet I got those 7 votes that made the difference. So it really is important to, if you decide to do something like that, to give it your all, to go into it 100%. When my wife and I moved to Stafford County 40 years ago, we got a little involved in some of the local politics. I wasn't a member of the Stafford County Republican Committee, but we would help candidates when they were running primarily for state offices. And I never really thought about running myself. And then the fellow who was our delegate, member of the House of Delegates, was moving out of the district and couldn't continue to serve. And my wife and I talked about it, and we decided I decided that I would give it a try. And it was interesting running the first time. I was a 3-way race, so I had a Democrat opponent and an independent opponent, and but it worked out okay. And to your point, Dr. Cooperman, I enjoyed it. I thought it was an opportunity to get. Let me give you a quick example. When I first went in the House, my party was in a distinct minority. There were 34 Republicans, 66 Democrats, actually 65 and 1 independent. And it was hard to get meaningful legislation through. But I remember campaigning the first time around, and a woman came to me practically in tears. She was a teacher and loved teaching, but the State Board of Education was looking at a regulation that would say you can't teach in public school unless you have a master's degree in your area of teaching. Well, that's all well and good if you don't have problems getting teachers and you don't mind paying them, if you've got the money to pay them more because they've got an advanced degree. But do you really need a master's degree in physics to teach physics? Do you really need a master's degree in history to teach history? There was a lot of documentation that said there's really no correlation between having an advanced, that's not talking about universities now, but having an advanced degree and being a more effective K through 12 teacher. And I put in a resolution. I knew I wouldn't get legislation through, but I put in a resolution that required the State Board of Education to look at all these pros and cons of this edict that they were getting ready to pass down. The resolution passed. I think it just no one paid any attention to it. And to their credit, the State Board of Elections the State Board of Education did a good job of looking at it, and came up with the same thing. Hey, this isn't going to do us any good, and it's going to cost us a lot of money. We're going to lose a lot of teachers. And so they rescinded it. Well, I really was proud of myself then, because here this constituent had come to me with a problem. I was able to do something about it the first year. And I've loved that part of serving, where you really, so much of serving is constituent services. And they're not as interested in necessarily a new law that's going to do this for higher education or whatever. But they want their life to be ironed out. I suspect I've probably gotten more pats on the back for helping people with the division of motor vehicles. They have a problem where something's stuck in the mire, and you're able to cut through the red tape. So anyway, I would encourage you all to look at public service through serving in elected office. oh, they're starting to bail out on me now. And it doesn't have to be in elected office. You can do an awful lot by just working with an election committee. My goodness, you know, we have elections in Virginia this year, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done on both sides of the aisle for the 3 statewide offices as well as the local members of the House of Delegates. So get involved, and I really would encourage you at some point to think about. I wasn't a spring chicken when I got involved in politics. You don't have to get into it. In fact, I like seeing people run when they're closer to their middle age than right out of college, because they have some life experiences and they have some things they can do. We in the House, and this is no offense to anybody here, we'll have people run successfully, and they come into the House at the age of 28, 29, and they don't want to stay in the House. They want to be President of the United States someday. This is sort of a stepping stone for them, and they're very ambitious and very aggressive. I prefer the woman or man who comes in and they've, Dr. Coopman and I were talking on the way over. One of the neat things about the Virginia state legislature, and a lot of state legislatures, are they're part-time. We're what we call citizen legislators. They don't pay you very much money to serve, so you have to have a job back home. And in the House now, we've got 2 pharmacists, we got a couple of farmers, we got too many lawyers. Actually, we don't have enough lawyers, but we do have maybe a dozen lawyers. We used to have a guy. He lost an election. He was an inventor, and he had a patent. You know, when you watch football on television, that yellow line that shows you the first down, he brought that thing to market. That was his idea, and he was able to. Whenever you see the yellow line, Joe May up in Loudoun County developed that for you. I asked Joe one time. I said, "Do you get a nickel every time that thing's shown on television?" And he said, "No, he got his nickels up front." But the point is, you got all kinds of different people: inventors, farmers. We have teachers. We have retired teachers, active teachers. And so that mix, if I have an issue on some sort of opioid thing, I can talk to one or two of my pharmacists about it. If I've got an issue on agriculture, I've got farmers in the group that know a lot about it. So it's just, there's always somebody to go to that knows more about it than I do. That's helpful. Yes.
So the related question was talking about how you would interact with your constituents. Did they seek you out? Did you have, professors have office hours, right?
Right.
How would constituents get in touch with you, and what was on their minds?
Well, that's a good question, and everybody handles it differently. What I've done over the years is I have an office where I practice a little bit of law, but most of my time is spent on legislative stuff. And people feel free, if they see my car in the parking lot, just to come in and tell me what's on their mind, and that's good. That's healthy. The advent of social media has helped an awful lot. People. We have a Facebook page and we tweet and do. I don't, but I have people that do that for me. I don't know how to do that stuff. But we're on social media a lot, and one of the things we really encourage our members to do is to be active and involved in the community. And I go to a lot of events. Since I've been in, I think I've tried to go to every Eagle Scout Court of Honor to present a Virginia flag to the scout who's achieved the rank of eagle. Incidentally, I've tried to do that with the Girl Scouts with their, what do they call it, the Gold Award or something. And they never invite me back. But it's important that you stay involved in the community. When I come to work, most every morning I stop at a Wawa and get a cup of coffee. And it's kind of like the old general store from 100 years ago. People are just kind of milling about. And somebody invariably will come up to me and say, "Good job on this," or "Why'd you do that?" or whatever. But you hear from people. Talking about social media, and I'm going to ramble again here, but this is a new story for me. Recently, I went to Cape Cod, and I see your shirt says Cape Cod. Never been there before. And there was a meeting on civility in legislatures, and which is kind of an oxymoron, I guess. And they'd asked me to come and participate on a panel and to talk a little bit. about civility. And in Virginia, I think, and this was my point to the group, in Virginia we have a pretty good system. We don't have an uncivil situation on the floor. We don't allow people to get up and be talking badly to somebody else or yelling or interrupting or doing things like can't do that. And so the legislative process itself is fairly civil. What's not civil, and I think I really attribute a lot of this to social media, is the constituent feedback that you get. It used to be, I will say 10 or 15 years ago, if I did something that my constituent or a constituent didn't approve of, he'd write me a letter, or maybe she'd come by and see me and at the office and say, you know, you shouldn't have voted that way, why'd you do this? Or they'd give me a phone call. Now, I'll get 350 emails from all over the country, not necessarily from my district or even Virginia. And the illustration, I was giving this group, here's a group of, these were legislative leaders from around the country, about 24 of them, and I was giving this illustration during the ongoing battle over whether we should expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act in Virginia, which so far we've elected not to do. And I've been a proponent of not expanding for lots of reasons we could talk about. And I got an email from a guy in Richmond who identified himself as a Roman Catholic priest. And I Googled him after I read his email, and sure enough, he was. I think he might have been defrocked. He didn't seem to have a church, but he was very adamant. He said, I know why you're opposed to Medicaid expansion. He said, it's because you're a racist. And he said, you should tell your constituents you're a racist, although I suspect they already know it. He said, I hope you burn in hell, and I hope your grandchildren burn in hell. And one of the guys raised his hand. He said, are you a Catholic? And I said, no. He said, you'll be okay. But that's the kind of toxicity that's out there now, and that's the kind of thing that is, to my mind, has just kind of gone too far. You get those kind of responses from time to time. I can't hear very well, so that's good.
Sorry. Do you think that it's a good thing that the Virginia state legislature and state legislatures are normally less publicized in the media than, like, say, the federal? But do you think it's a good thing in that there's less, like, partisanship fighting and less individuals trying to make a name for themselves? And it seems that from what you're talking about, that the state legislature is more of a cohesive unit.
Well, I think that's a good point. You don't read as much about the state legislature as you do the federal legislature. I kind of like that. I like kind of being under the radar. And I think maybe that's a reason why you don't have as much political rhetoric that goes on at the federal level. I'm very disappointed, as I bet you a lot of you all are, in this Congress. We're up there now, the House and the Senate. They really can't seem to get anything done, and a lot of it is because of this political situation of taking a stand and saying, I'm not going to budge off of this, and that's not the way we need to make laws. Some of our best laws that we've passed in Virginia over the past 5 or 10 years have been bipartisan. They would not have passed if one party put them forward, but yet that takes both the parties. And we do enjoy a better relationship. It's not perfect, and especially during campaign time, you'll see a lot of arguments going out for and against people, sometimes factual, sometimes not. But during the legislative session, we do seem to get along a lot better together. The minority leader of the House is from Charlottesville, and he's probably as liberal as I'm conservative, but he's a very nice guy, and we get along. He's very civil, and we're able to work together. Some of my stronger supporters over the years have been in the other side of the aisle, and I suspect that's because, again, we have this I think this atmosphere of being able to work together a little bit better than they do in Washington. That's not a very high bar, but that's true. But that's a good question. How about other questions? You're going to have a test if I'm.
I have two more here. Okay. Virginia is the seat of the Confederacy, and yet the Virginia of the 21st century looks a lot different. With those 2 points in mind, what do you think about the controversy over Confederate monuments?
Oh, that's a great question, and it's certainly topical. I have a friend, if any of you all are Civil War scholars, you'll recognize the name as a fellow named Bud Robertson, and Bud has written a lot of books on the Civil War from the Southern viewpoint primarily. He taught at Virginia Tech for about 45 years a course in the Civil War. And when this all started coming, this was a year ago, I remember talking with him about it, and he said, Bill, the trouble is people are looking at what happened 150 years ago through today's lenses. And it was obviously quite a different, not a good situation 150, 200 years ago, but it was the way things were done. And that's part of our history. And another friend of mine was saying, you know, Bill, this taking down these monuments is like book burning. We don't agree with that history, and so we're going to get rid of it. I think it's important to. I think that the context is important, and if you wanted to, if you had a statue of Jackson or Lee or somebody like that, you could talk about the fact that they owned slaves or they fought against their country. But there's so many things that we don't really understand that was going through their mind. When Robert E. Lee was in the U.S. Army and resigned his commission to take control of the Confederate Army, we should remember that he was a Virginian. His family went back in Virginia for 200 and some years, and he was a Virginian first and a member of the United States second. The country was 70 years old, and so right or wrong, he's in a different position than we're in today, and it's hard to look. It's like Bud said, it's hard to look through what happened a while ago through today's lenses. I know it's upsetting to people. The thing I love about this country is how far we've come in the last 50 or 70 years. Now, I'm an old guy. When I was in college at the University of Richmond, blacks had to sit in the back of the bus. Blacks had to sit in the balcony of movie theaters. That's horrible. That was wrong. I didn't do anything about it, though. I probably should have. I know I should have. But the point is, 50 years later, the first governor the first African-American governor in the country was Doug Wilder in Virginia. We've elected for 8 years for 2 consecutive terms, the first African-American president of the United States. We've come a long ways. We're not there yet. But when you look at how far this country's come over the last 50 years, I think it's pretty remarkable. As far as the monuments go, I would like to see them kept up. When I say monuments, I'm thinking of the monuments on Monument Avenue in Richmond, but obviously they're everywhere. You have the slave stone here on William Street. Now, there's a guy named Hashmiel Turner who used to be on city council, who's a minister in town. I really respect him. He's a decent guy, a nice guy, smart guy, and he doesn't like the slave block, and he thinks it should be taken down. Wouldn't bother me because I think that's different. And I can see where that would be upsetting and offsetting to people. But these Monument Avenue type statues, first of all, a black member of city council in Richmond said, you know, it's going to cost millions of dollars to remove those statues. We've got a crumbling K through 12 system. Let's put the money in education. So, you know, there's a practical side of the whole thing. I think the bottom line is probably the local governments ought to have that control, but I don't know if that's going to happen or not. Sure.
This will be the first time in more than a few years that you are not running for elected position during the gubernatorial race. Any thoughts about Virginia elections coming up?
Well, the 3 statewide, I think the 3 statewide seats, got it, governor, attorney general, and lieutenant governor, probably are going to go together. I think if Ralph Northam wins the governorship, I think probably he'll bring along Herring, the attorney general candidate on the Democrat side. Lieutenant governor is a little different, and the same if Ed Gillespie were to win. I think it's a very close race. Unfortunately for us, for Republicans, so much of it is dependent on what happens in Washington. And it's so uncertain what's going to happen up there. The one thing that really hurt the Republican brand in the last election 4 years ago was the federal government shutdown. They couldn't agree on a spending plan, and so they shut down government for not long enough, five days, something like that. If we were to have a government shutdown in October, that would really, I think, sink the Republican vote. Fortunately, they've come up with this compromise, and this is a compromise that a lot of Republicans are angry about. But I think President Trump said, "Hey, I can't work with you guys. I need to get help on the other side of the aisle." And they do have a deal where they're putting it off until at least December. So that's not going to hurt. But so much depends on what happens in Washington. So much happens worldwide. My goodness, with North Korea and the problems we have there, and the risks and the harm. I don't know what's going to happen there in the next 60 days. I do think, and I'm biased, obviously, I do think that Ed Gillespie has offered a better program. He's come out with different policy decisions. He's talked about, I think we need to do this about opioids, and I think we need to do this about higher education. He's had policy positions on about anything you can think of. Ralph Northam, the Democrat, has been talking primarily about Trump and what a mistake he is. And then again, the Democrat Party has their own problems. They have been moving to the left pretty quickly. The Bernie Sanders, Tom Perriello movement has really forced Ralph Northam, who in his heart is, I think, a fairly moderate guy, to move to some pretty progressive positions. And I'm not sure they're popular with all Virginians. So much depends on what happens in Northern Virginia. Fairfax and Loudoun and Prince William are so important, and people think differently. It's not old Virginia, and that's not bad, but you have to adjust for it. And then, of course, we have all 100 of the House seats are up, and there's a lot of there are, I think, 60 Democrat challengers this year, which is an all-time high. I suspect at the end of the day the Republicans will keep the majority in the House. They may lose a couple of seats. Right now it's 66-34 Republican Democrat, and I could see them losing a couple. I beg your pardon? A flip from when you started. Yes, exactly. Took a while. Any other questions or thoughts? Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate the questions. And okay.
So I was going to ask, what are some of the problems Virginia is facing? And because, I lived in Loudoun County my whole life. I recently moved down here, so I'm not too well versed with the rest of the state. So I just want to know what some of the problems are in living in the state and stuff.
Okay. Well, the problems are manifold. The biggest problem, and I think everybody here, what's in the biggest problem, is the one that most people complain about, is traffic, transportation. And we passed, in fact, this was an example of the bipartisan effort. It was a bipartisan effort to pass the first transportation funding bill in about 30 years in 2013. And with that, we were injecting over $1 billion in new money into transportation. But that's not enough. And you see, one of the problems, especially here on the 95 corridor, is Interstate 95 is the eastern backbone of transportation for the whole United States. And sometimes when I'm driving to Richmond, I'm going to Richmond after I leave here, this will show you what a mindless guy I am. I'll count the number of cars that pass me or that I pass with out-of-state licenses, and the number of trucks and the number of Virginia cars that I pass. And it's overwhelmingly trucks and out-of-state cars. So Virginia doesn't have the money, but they shouldn't be held responsible for improving 95. And I'm not sure what can be done to improve it. If they put 2 more lanes on, they'll fill them up right away. What's going to improve it? What's going to help? And I tell this when I'm talking to high school kids. I said, when you're in your 40s, you won't believe that your parents got up at 4:30 in the morning to get on a bus to ride up to Crystal City, because you'll be working at a remote center or at home or whatever. I do think telework's going to help disperse a lot of jobs and make it more sensible. But we're a little ways off from that. You know, at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, one of the larger problems that big cities had was what to do with dead horse carcasses and horse manure. That was the main type of transportation. It pulled the wagons, it did all this stuff, and a horse would keel over and die. What do you do with them? And the internal combustion machine came along and fixed that problem. So we don't use horses anymore, but it's created another problem. But technology is going to help on that. But in the meantime, we still obviously need to do that. Transportation is important. Higher education is very important. The cost of higher education keeps going up and up and up. And the reason why is you won't believe what these professors make working here.
I'm not so sure about that.
There's a lot of reasons why the cost keeps going up. One of the reasons is the state should probably be doing more. But the state has limited funds, anyway, higher education is a key issue. K through 12 is always an issue. This opioid crisis is incredible, and one of the problems we have in Virginia right now is the workforce. Is we don't have the new kind of jobs. You know, for years in Virginia, we kind of got fat and happy off of the federal government. It was never going to go away. I can remember people saying, probably said it myself, Virginia's recession-proof because of the federal government and the military. We'll never go into a recession when the rest, well, we did. The military has really been hurt, the military presence has been hurt by sequestration and just the uncertainty in Washington over the past 8 years or 10 years has caused a lot of these jobs that are government contractors and things to scale back. And we're seeing that. And Virginia needs to do a better job of balancing their economy. We need to do more with what they call advanced manufacturing. We need to do more with agriculture and some things that we can. And we're working on that, but we have a ways to go there. You know, one of the problems we have, I remember talking with, actually it was the governor told me this, don't tell him I told you. The governor was saying, Bill, I could get a big factory to move into Southwest Virginia and create 1,000 new jobs. And we couldn't find 1,000 workers. Anybody here from Southwest Virginia? We couldn't find 1,000 workers because of drug tests. And we drive out in Westmoreland County a bit. Anybody here from Westmoreland County? Where are y'all from? Besides Cape Cod.
Lots of Northern Virginia.
Anyway, a lot of Northern Virginia here. We drive by this place where these two young men make these trailers, and they sell them all over the country. And I guess for the last year, they've had a sign, wanted welders, wanted truck drivers with a CDL license. And I don't know why they can't find them. Probably part of it is education. We don't have the education structure to teach people to be welders. But part of it, I think, is drug testing. Part of it is kids don't want to work. But anyway.
Well, we have a whole group of students who are very interested in working and probably interested in either getting to lunch or their next class. So with that, we're going to call it a day for this. Thank you so much, Delegate Howell, for sharing an hour with us. And talk to you today. Folks, we'll see you on Wednesday. Make sure you pick up a Constitution on the way out if you